My specific goal is going to be to give a deep dive into the evolutionary theory part of all this. And we'll touch back on emerging diseases again at the end. And for those of you that have heard this all before, I apologize, but maybe you'll hear it in a different way or an interesting way. Okay. So, okay. So, a few statements to get out of the way right away. And I don't think that I need to belabor any of these things, but the biosphere is an evolutionary system, right? It survived countless previous kinds, frequencies, intensities of perturbations before. And in terms of this current period of global change, it'll survive again. It may not be with technological humanity. It may not be with the ecosystems we depend on, but it will survive again, just the way it survived massive perturbations in the past. And the way it's done this, as I think we all recognize, is by constantly evolving, by constantly coping with change by changing. So it's all about survival. It's all about being good enough to deal with, number one, the current conditions, and number two, changes in those conditions. You know, changes in future unpredictable conditions. You have to be good enough to deal with them when they come. Otherwise, you go extinct. So evolution is not about being the best. It's not about being the fittest. It's really all about being adequate, sufficient, again, just good enough at every step of the way to keep on keeping on. And as an overall message, overarching message from this talk, but just more generally, things that we've been writing in the last few years, the idea is that we can better mimic the evolutionary process or how nature works to increase the odds of technological humanity survival in numerous ways, including with our economic systems and all kinds of other ways, but specifically for our purposes, including how we deal with emerging infectious diseases. So just quickly, I'll throw out there that a lot of what comes from this talk comes from, first and foremost, the Stockholm Paradigm book that Dan Brooks and Eric Hoberg and Walter Beeger have written. But also from the two books that I've written with Dan on evolution. And also this recent compendium that Scott and Dan and Walter and Eric have put together through the Manther Lab that's all about putting evolutionary or emerging infectious diseases in an evolutionary framework, or at least the approach to dealing with them in an evolutionary framework. So as a starting point, I wrote in my chapter in this compendium, EID is an expected outcome of the same Darwinian dynamics, an expression of the same evolutionary potential that governs the response of the rest of the biosphere during periods of environmental change, obviously. So, you know, if we want to understand emerging infectious disease, we have to understand the larger dynamics of the biosphere, how it responds to change, and come to a realization that, in fact, emerging infectious disease is one of the expected outcomes when the biosphere is changing. Sorry about that. And another point that I don't have to belabor, obviously, with this group is that parasite diversity is huge. And in fact, I don't come from a background of traditional parasitology. My background is in insect plant research. But when we talk about parasites, or at least when I talk about parasites, we're being extremely broad, extremely inclusive, including traditional parasites and viruses and bacteria and nematodes, but also plant-feeding insects, even plants that grow on other plants. So lots of things can be considered parasites. And of course, the diversity of parasites is massive. And we all understand what emerging infectious diseases are, that they're extremely expensive and cost the world trillions of dollars per year in treatment costs and production losses. And very basically and very fundamentally, what is an emerging infectious disease, or when does an emerging infectious disease occur? It occurs when some parasite colonizes some kind of novel host, whether it's an evolutionarily novel host, something it truly has never actually seen before in its evolutionary history, or maybe even an old host that it hasn't been in contact with for some time. So most generally, emerging infectious diseases result from host switching, which is the general term I'll use. It's been called other things, but this idea of a parasite shifting to a new host. And host switching stems very basically from, number one, the capacity of some parasite to jump to some new host or infect some new host, and the opportunity to meet these hosts. So basically the capacity of the organism and the ecological opportunity of that organism to use those capacities. Now, if we think about the historical caricature of parasites and how parasites have been thought of traditionally, there's several things that come to mind. And the first one is that they traditionally have been viewed as really the exemplars of the evolution of specialization, right? They have highly intimate physiological, morphological, ecological relationships with their hosts. They need their hosts to survive. So when we combine this with the idea that they have narrow host ranges, it's not surprising that there's been this overarching assumption, at least historically, that parasitism is essentially an evolutionary dead end. Right, that there's such intense coevolution, such an intense coevolutionary arms race between a parasite and its host, that it becomes so highly specialized to that host that it essentially loses the ability or capacity to colonize any other host. And this leads to the idea, or at least the old idea, historical idea, of parasitism being an evolutionary dead end. So if the host goes extinct, then so does the parasite. But at this point, it's pretty clear, and I'm not going to belabor this point. There's a mountain of evidence, meta-analyses, and various other avenues of evidence that show that host switching is a common phenomenon in nature, at least common enough to be frequently observed. And sometimes in some literature, this has been called spillover. It's been called various things in various literatures by various groups of people. But the bottom line is that the common phenomena of parasites switching or somehow moving or colonizing evolutionary novel hosts is everywhere. And emerging infectious disease is an emergent property of this larger phenomena. And the fact that there's an EID crisis, this increasing frequency of emerging infectious disease, implies that the capacity for this host switching is very large. And more importantly, that the opportunities to do so are becoming more common. So we've called this the parasite paradox, or this has been called the parasite paradox, which is basically the idea of, or it poses the question, if parasites are so highly specialized to their host, they have such narrow host ranges, they're in such intense coevolutionary arms races that their variation gets whittled down so much that they can't do anything except infect their current host, then how do they actually switch to new hosts? And the answer is simple. I mean, the answer is Darwinism, right? They use the information they've inherited to do something new, like switch to a new host. I mean, the only other way that this could potentially happen is if the moment they encounter some new potential host, they evolve new capacities somehow, fortuitously or by some magical way. They evolve a new capacity at the moment they encounter a new host. And that's really Lamarckism, right? That's the idea that the environment is in charge and it's essentially causing the organism to come up with an adaptation. But that's not how it works. They already have the capacity to use the novel host based on inherited information. And of course, this is Darwinism. So just because two species interact in nature, and this is what's important, it doesn't mean they've had a long or intimate history of coevolution or co-speciation. And this was a pretty widespread message in insect plant research by the 1980s, and it's taken longer to penetrate in parasitology, but I think it's becoming a pretty widespread and recognized message. So parasitism is not just a dead end, and of course we have emerging infectious diseases. So if we think about this assumption that high host specificity or narrow host range is synonymous with a lack of capacity to colonize new hosts, it stems from a few misconceptions, or at least it fails to recognize a few facts about parasites. Number one, it's not so much, or it's not that parasites are specialized to specific species, but that they're specialized on specific resources. And this is important because these resources can be phylogenetically conserved across a much wider array of species than the current host or the ancestral host that they evolve with. So parasites have the capacity to use any species that contain the specific resource if given the opportunity, which is the key. So if we're talking about something like SARS and COVID-19, it's the case that mammals in general possess the ACE2 receptor that's the entry point for infection of SARS. So it's not surprising that if given the opportunity for SARS to basically switch from bats to other mammals, including humans, it's not surprising that they take advantage of that opportunity. So, and all this is actually part of a much more general evolutionary question that we can ask ourselves. And the more general evolutionary question is, how can an organism that evolves the capacity to function under one set of conditions keep functioning when those conditions change? And again, we all know the answer. The answer is Darwinism. Now, the answer is that it uses the pre-existing information that it inherited, which contains the potential to do something new, like possibly switch to a new host. So understanding the dynamics of emerging infectious disease is about a more general understanding of how organisms use the limited information that they inherit to cope when the conditions change. And this is kind of the essence of what the Stockholm paradigm is it's a general synthetic, we can call it eco-evolutionary framework that explains this, that explains how the biosphere, how individual organisms and the ecosystems that they form cope or deal with change by changing. And fundamentally, it's based on Darwinism, and it's Darwinian. So at the very roots, the Stockholm paradigm describes the integration of the capacity for organisms to engage with their environment, the ecological opportunities to use those capacities, and the repeated perturbations in the conditions that actually catalyze this interaction and ultimately catalyze diversification and complexity. So if we go back to Darwin, he presented two what we'll call major metaphors that we're all familiar with. Of course, the first major metaphor is the tree of life, representing the selective accumulation of biodiversity, its evolutionary history of common descent. But he also presented the metaphor of the entangled bank, right? And basically, the entangled bank it portrays the interactions amongst the diversity in the tree of life. And it basically gives rise to our modern notion of complex ecosystems. So if we think about Darwin's entangled bank, or we think about an ecosystem, or if we think about, for example, representing an ecosystem as a food web, really what we're talking about is talking about looking at snapshots of evolutionary systems, right? So if we construct a food web, or we construct, a map of an ecosystem, it's a snapshot of a dynamic evolutionary system. And if we look at it that way, then the central question becomes, or I think one of Darwin's central questions was, how do these systems, how do ecosystems and their constituent members, how do they persist in the face of constant change? And I think that's what the Stockholm Paradigm is all about explaining. So to answer this, we're going to break it down into two levels. First, we're going to look at how individual inheritance systems cope with change. And by inheritance systems, we mean species, populations, lineages. And then we'll scale it up and think about it in an ecosystem context. So if we think about this problem at the level of individual inheritance systems, again, individual species, individual populations, however you want to think about it, we can go back to Darwin for our starting point. And I want to point out here that this paper by Dan, which really I had forgot about until I was putting this talk together, I think he published in 2011, is the first paper, I believe, to highlight this passage from the origin and the importance of this passage. And the passage is I'll read it, but I mean, everyone could read it on screen. So let's take a look at this. This is Darwin at the very beginning of the origin. He's basically giving a synopsis of what his theory is. And he writes that there are two factors in evolution, namely the nature of the organism and the nature of the conditions. So he's recognizing right away that evolution is a result of the interaction between organisms and the conditions. But he goes on to say that the former seems to be much more important. So the nature of the organism seems to be much more important. For nearly similar variations sometimes arise, as far as we can judge, under dissimilar conditions. And on the other hand, dissimilar variations arise under conditions which appear to be nearly uniform. So what's interesting about Darwin is that, unlike Lamarck, he completely rejected the idea that the environment was the driver of evolution. He recognized that it's in fact organisms with their conservative inheritance that are actually imposing themselves on the conditions. And so he recognized the primacy of the nature of the organism in evolution. And so he saw right away that it's not about coming up with the right adaptation at the right time, which was basically Lamarck's solution. It's about having the pre-existing capacity to respond when the conditions change. And that's the fundamental fuel for evolution. So let's think about some key characteristics of the nature of the organism. And the first thing we'll recognize is that organisms are cohesive functional wholes. Right? They're cohesive functional wholes that have what John Collier basically explained as the informational capacity to impose themselves on their surroundings in ways that facilitate survival and reproduction. But more specifically, and most fundamentally, what kind of cohesive functional whole are they? They're combined metabolic inheritance systems. Right? Organisms are both a metabolic system and an inheritance system. And of course, those two things are linked together with inheritance specifying metabolism. So they're combined metabolic inheritance systems, giving them the ability to both exploit and explore their surroundings. So if we think about what metabolism is, or what metabolism or organisms use metabolism for, they use metabolism to stay alive. But what does that mean? They use metabolism to exploit their surroundings as best they can using their inherited capacities, essentially buying the time for reproduction to occur. Inheritance, on the other hand, is how organisms extend themselves through time and essentially explore their surroundings through the production of offspring, highly similar but variable offspring. And the combined metabolic inheritance system is, again, a functional whole with the information encoded in inheritance specifying the metabolic system, and with metabolism fueling inheritance. Okay. So in addition to being these functional wholes, these combined metabolic inheritance systems, we can also think of organisms as highly historical entities, right? They form communities of descent with shared evolutionary history. And in fact, it's the case, and this is why Darwin argued that the nature of the organism is the primary factor in evolution. They retain so much of their history in inheritance that basically common descent is always the predominant explanation for the current form and function of an organism. And again, we say this in one of the books, Dan and I, if you rear fruit flies in the wild, or if you rear them in a glass bottle, you still get fruit flies, you know, pointing to the primacy of the nature of the organism over the nature of the conditions. So the primacy of the nature of the organism emerges fundamentally from inheritance itself and the nature of inheritance. So the first thing to recognize about inheritance is that it's highly conservative. Of course, the inheritance system is open to change, it's evolvable, but the change is highly constrained, right? There's a requirement for functional integration with the rest of the system, which keeps the whole system very conservative. Any change that comes along has to be able to integrate with the rest of the system. But nevertheless, it produces indefinite variation. This is what's amazing about the inheritance system. It's highly conservative to change, but it's constantly changing and produces indefinite variation. Because of things like mutation, imperfect copying, duplication, recombination, all offspring are highly similar, but they're all unique. And in fact, even clones have been shown to be not completely identical. Thirdly, inheritance is highly historical, right? So we know that each organism is unique, yes, but they all bear a strong resemblance to their relatives. And some of these resemblances go, you know, they go back, they're truly ancient, like Hox genes, for example, that specify development in metazoans. And inheritance is superfluous. Reproduction occurs basically, or it occurs without regard for the conditions. Organisms make as many offspring as possible, and it doesn't matter what the conditions are. So there's a lot of reproductive overrun. There's constant reproductive overrun with organisms producing a lot more offspring than the environment can actually support. And all this leads to a constant mismatch between organisms and their surroundings, and from this mismatch emerges natural selection. And of course, this is, I think everyone knows this already as Darwinism. But this is the important thing here. Within this mismatch lies the evolutionary potential for coping with future change. So it's the mismatch itself. It's the fact that organisms can never actually be perfectly fit for their current conditions that leads to a mismatch that leads to evolutionary potential for coping with some future change. Okay. So if we think about what's the goal of life? Now, arguably, the only discernible goal of life is survival, is continued survival. And as we've said, this is fueled by metabolism, but achieved through reproduction and inheritance. So metabolism allows organisms time, or buys organisms time to exploit the environment long enough to reproduce, but inheritance is what allows exploration of the conditions when they change. To be a good exploiter, you have to be able to function well enough in the current conditions. To be a good explorer, you need to be able to cope when those conditions change. So to be evolvable, organisms need to be able to do both. So to be evolvable, you have to be able to both exploit the current conditions well enough to survive and reproduce, but also have some capacity to explore, to do something new when those conditions change. And again, it's the inherent nature of the information in the inheritance system that produces essentially this indefinite capacity to respond when conditions change, despite persistent natural selection for better performing variants. So yes, there's always natural selection occurring for better performing variants, but nevertheless, the nature of the inheritance system is constantly producing indefinite variation and an indefinite and growing capacity to respond to changing conditions. So let's work through this figure here and kind of see how that all comes, see how that all emerges from the inheritance system. So the first thing to mention is that there's always background mutation and mistakes during replication, imperfect copying, these types of things that are a background source of de novo variation in the inheritance system. But beyond that, the information encoded in the inheritance system, DNA, is both digital and combinatorial. So that's the first thing I want to think about. The fact that the information is both digital and combinatorial, so it can be recombined and read at multiple levels, at multiple times, this generates enormous potential, or it generates an enormous amount of information that can be stored and expressed by inheritance systems. Now, of course, there's constraints, right? There's constraints on the inheritance system. And as evolution unfolds, these constraints build up. So these constraints take the form of genetic correlations, but also mate recognition systems, symbioses. All these things can constrain the information that could be expressed, but nevertheless, the fact that the system is digital, that replication is combinatorial, it generates enormous amounts of pre-existing variation for evolution to act on when the conditions change. The third thing to recognize is that the inheritance system evolves and diversifies. The information within it expands. And so does the difference between the information that is expressed and the information that could be expressed. And this is Darwin's recognition that diversity begets diversity. When we have an expanding system of accumulating information or variation, realizing one possibility always produces new possibilities. And so in this way, life kind of grows its own capacity space, or what's actually been called the window of vitality by Robert Ulanowitz. And the important point here is that it's this difference between realized capacities, realized information, realized diversity, and what's possible, potential capacity, potential information, potential diversity. That window, that gap, that space is evolutionary potential, right? The potential for something new to happen when the conditions change. Okay, this is also the Brooks-Wiley dynamic. At least that's what I call it, because this all stems from Dan and Ed Wiley's Evolution as Entropy book from the 1980s. The point here is that if we're thinking about EID, coming back to emerging infectious disease, from this perspective, the risk space for host switching and EID is huge and indefinite, assuming that parasites have the same kind of evolutionary potential that all other organisms have. So the growth of capacity space as evolution unfolds is indefinite, and it's ever growing. But of course, it's not unlimited. Like, as we said, as evolution unfolds, historical correlations in the system start to build up, genetic correlations start to build up. So what's possible becomes constrained. So the rate of diversification slows down over time. But nevertheless, the system keeps diversifying indefinitely. But this buildup of correlations and slowdown of the rate of diversification, which we can call the cost of integration, while it places really actually severe constraints on, again, the rate of evolution, but also what's possible, it also facilitates evolution in a couple key ways. It lowers what we've called the cost of innovation in a couple key ways. And the first thing it does is that it reduces the threshold for generating novel information, because inheritance is mainly recycling and recombining old information. So the conservative nature of inheritance, even though it's a huge constraint on what's possible and how responsive evolution can be, it also lowers, again, the threshold for generating novel information, because it's, using what it has. It's recycling what it has and recombining it. So this alleviates the inability to produce the right adaptation at the right time. And secondly, it slows down the entire evolutionary process. And the important thing to recognize here is that by slowing down the process and essentially storing history, storing different elements of evolution, it buys time for pre-existing parts to actually meet up. Right, so something can evolve at one point in time in one place, be retained conservatively in the system, and meet up with something else later in evolutionary time. So if we think about what it takes to persist indefinitely as an organism, as an inheritance system, it relies far more on having the potential to cope when the conditions change, and less on how fit you actually are to the current conditions. You only need to be fit enough for the current conditions, fit enough to survive long enough to hopefully have the potential or the capacity to deal with whatever change comes along. And for the Stockholm paradigm, the essential point is that all inheritance systems retain this potential to some degree. This is a fundamental element of an inheritance system, an involvable inheritance system, even parasites. Okay. So that was Darwin's, or at least a Darwinian view of the nature of the organism. So the nature of the organism is the capacity to exploit the current conditions and to explore future conditions. But of course, the opportunities to do these things are a function of the conditions themselves. So we can think of the nature of the conditions as essentially giving rise to an opportunity space where organisms can find chances for survival that are dependent on, again, their inherited capacities. And if we think about the global opportunity space available to living organisms, for any given species, a subset of this global opportunity space will be suitable for survival and reproduction. So we can think of this as this species or this inheritance system's realized opportunity space. But I think more commonly, we would refer to this as fitness space. So we can think of fitness space as emerging from the interaction between capacity and opportunity, giving rise to some fitness space. And the important thing is that organisms are fit for any conditions they have the capacity to survive and reproduce in. So the fundamental demographic of evolution is not survival of the fittest, which is, kind of the mantra that's repeated all the time, but really more accurately, survival of the fit. Right? Survival requires being adequate, being good enough, not necessarily being the best. So all organisms that reproduce are fit. And this fittest collective, or what we might refer to as a genotypic or phenotypic distribution, it's this fittest collective that represents the evolutionary potential to cope when the conditions change. So conservative inheritance all but guarantees that fitness space will be sloppy, specifically not tightly optimized to any particular set of conditions, but that there will be some inherent difference between realized fitness space, or what organisms are doing, and fundamental fitness space, what they could doing. And this difference is effectively proportional to their capacity to cope with change. And the important point is that to be evolvable, all species have to maintain some kind of inheritable difference between what we'll call the actual and possible in fitness space. Right? This is how the collective biosphere has coped with change over the past 4 billion years, including parasites. So understanding how species mount a response when conditions change, an initial response when the conditions change, is really key to understanding and managing emerging infectious disease. But again, it all really boils down to a more general understanding of what happens to inheritance systems, or what are the dynamics of inheritance systems in sloppy fitness space, again, when the conditions are changing. And since organisms will produce as many offspring as they can, and since all these offspring are highly similar, and this is going to occur regardless of the conditions, reproductive overrun is inevitable. And Darwin recognized this as a constant struggle for survival, and that organisms were routinely in what we'll call conflict with their surroundings, including other organisms. So reproductive overrun, or superfluous reproduction, means that all inheritance systems can grow too much and become what we can call victims of their own success. Basically, come into conflict because of for demographic reasons, but also the conditions can change and they may become victims of circumstance. Whatever the situation, whether they become victims of their own success or victims of circumstance, both of these trigger what we can call Darwinian conflict resolution. And so, yes, even though Darwin recognized that conflict was an inevitable part of living systems, he also recognized that there needed to be a conflict resolution mechanism. So let's take a look at this figure and work through it a little bit, and hopefully I could do a good job of explaining it. So if we just look at the figure and we look at panel A, the little dots connected by lines, that's our inheritance system. And we can see that in panel A, it's concentrated, or we'll say specialized, in its fitness space. So when conditions are stable, like we'll say in A, exploiting the surroundings as much as possible takes precedence over exploring them, right? So in this case, there's going to be a tendency for an inheritance system to be specialized in some preferred region of fitness space, like in panel A. So what happens when these conditions change? Whether it's because they become a victim of their own success or a victim of circumstance, it doesn't really matter. The point is that when the conditions change, the inheritance system explores new opportunities for survival in fitness space. So it begins to spread out in fitness space. It begins to become more generalized. And so a way to think about this is that pre-existing variation is starting to wander into more marginal and or previously inaccessible parts of fitness space. And we can see this process playing out in A to B to C. And the important thing, or an important thing to recognize, is that within the Stockholm paradigm, there's no such thing as specialist and generalist species as nouns, as static things. Instead, these are actually dynamic traits of dynamic species. And from this perspective, it's actually the case that all species have the capacity to become more specialized or generalized in their own fitness space. And so from this perspective, they each have the capacity to oscillate in their own fitness space between being more specialized or fluctuate or alternate, whatever word you want to use, between being more specialized and more generalized. So this initial first step here is what we can just call in general ecological fitting, using pre-existing information to do something new when conditions change. And it's the first step towards an inherited system exploring what's possible. Now, ecological fitting alone would not lead to the selective accumulation of diversity that we see in the tree of life. So as Darwin recognized, there has to be a conflict resolution mechanism that results in effectively speciation. And we can see this play out in D through E. Now we've got a subpopulation becoming isolated in another part of fitness space. And now it may undergo selection and isolation from the original population. Ultimately, we can get a speciation event. And now we have a new inheritance system that has its own fitness space, part of which overlaps because of phylogenetic history, and part of it, which is a new fitness space, and effectively conflict has been resolved. But because the nature of the organism always predominates, conflict resolution is always going to lead to new conflict. So in this way, we get the buildup and accumulation of diversity. And so it goes, right? So if we think about it from this perspective, we can think of Darwinian evolution as an iterative process of conflict and conflict resolution. Diversity is accumulating, not replacing itself, because the criteria for evolutionary success is just to be good enough, right? Just to reproduce. It's survival of the fit. So diversity is accumulating, whatever's good works and hangs around. And each time conflict is resolved, it sets the stage for new conflict. So the fuel that's driving this forward, the fuel that's driving evolution forward, is the potential emerging from pre-existing capacities to first explore and then exploit new opportunities in fitness space. When the conditions are stable, living systems build this potential. When conditions change, the potential is spent. So it's the generation, the maintenance, the deployment of this evolutionary potential. It's the key to being evolvable. But for our purposes, and for what we're interested in here, it's the fundamental source of emerging infectious disease. So if we want to understand EID as a phenomenon related to global change, we need a broad framework that describes how the collective biosphere responds when it's perturbed, and to gain an understanding of how EID is an emergent property of this, or is one phenomenon that from this process. So if we start thinking about ecosystems and what an ecosystem is, the first thing that we'll say is that it's an emergent property of each member's activities, each constituent species activities. And each of these species has its own inherited capacities to, again, both exploit and explore the conditions. So we can think of ecosystems as centers of exploitation for their constituent members. It's places where organisms use metabolism long enough to stay alive and reproduce, while also retaining some capacity to respond to new conditions when they change. So looking at it from this perspective, we can look at ecosystems as giving rise to a collective evolutionary potential, or there being a collective evolutionary potential stored within ecosystems, or what Dan and I have called an evolutionary commons, right? Essentially an evolutionary commons that is the collective evolutionary potential stored within an ecosystem. So when an ecosystem is perturbed, the expression of the evolutionary commons, of this evolutionary potential, it can result in rewiring of trophic connections, let's say within the ecosystem, like host switching. But on a large enough scale, it could actually cause ecosystems to break apart and to reform into new ecosystems or highly modified ecosystems. So thinking about it this way, the evolutionary commons, the fact that there is all this evolutionary potential stored within biodiversity itself and the ecosystems they form, this makes the biosphere extremely robust and resilient to perturbations. Not fragile, as is often assumed or is often portrayed. And if we think about this from the standpoint of mass extinctions, and usually when we talk about mass extinctions, we focus on the extinction part. It's also the case that after each mass extinction, there has been a mass evolutionary renewal. Again, pointing to how much potential, how much evolutionary potential is stored within extant biodiversity at any given time. So let's ask the question, what happens when external perturbations change the nature of the conditions, like, for example, in a mass extinction event, but not even necessarily that intense, change the nature of the conditions so much that essentially entire biotas, entire groups of species, entire ecosystems are affected at once? So what happens when basically the dimensions of fitness space are altered for entire biotas, entire groups of species? Well, if the conditions are altered, old opportunities to survive and reproduce, they may disappear, but new opportunities may arise. And of course, the nature of the organism to take advantage of these and explore new opportunities that were previously inaccessible or even non-existent. So to build a diverse, complex, persistent biosphere requires an essential ingredient: repeated systemic perturbations that routinely alter the fitness space of multiple species, right? Of groups of species at once. And it's these perturbations that catalyze the dynamics that cause living systems to, and again, whatever word you choose to use, oscillate, alternate, fluctuate between exploiting and exploring what we're going to break down into the geographical and functional dimensions of fitness space. So in the geographical dimension of fitness space, so thinking about this from a geographical perspective, what happens when the conditions change? Well, the taxon pulse hypothesis, which goes back to the 70s and 80s, basically says that when the conditions change, groups of species experience fluctuations in their geographic ranges, catalyzed by changes, by the breakdown of dispersal barriers, and that this drives diversification. And basically, when the conditions change, dispersal barriers break down, species expand geographically. This is tantamount to in the fitness space perspective, generalizing in fitness space and spending some evolutionary potential. The conditions may change again, dispersal barriers may reemerge, species may become isolated geographically, diversification is promoted, and in the fitness space, and again, now we have now we're specializing in fitness space and accumulating evolutionary potential. And there's a lot of empirical evidence for taxon pulses. I won't get into it, but a lot of evidence that large-scale environmental change is correlated with range expansions by species, followed by periods of diversification, in accord with the idea of these taxon pulses with large-scale, again, environmental change driving diversification. And the point is that a history of taxon pulses, repeated taxon pulses, produces biotas that are idiosyncratic. They're composed of lots of different species that have been associated with each other for lots of different times and have arrived under lots of different conditions. And this leads to large-scale biotic mixing. And the biotic mixing catalyzes phases of intense exploration of new opportunities for survival, including exploiting other species. So along with fluctuations in geographical fitness space, the oscillation hypothesis is the idea that species fluctuate between generalizing and specializing in functional fitness space. And this is easy to visualize for groups of things that form intimate interactions with each other, like parasites and their hosts. So we can think of essentially as host space being part of functional fitness space. And since host space is a part of fitness space, we expect host space to be sloppy. We expect there to be a difference between the set of hosts that are being used and the set of hosts that could be used. And for parasites, the capacity for ecological fitting to switch to new hosts means that they can take advantage of opportunities to explore new hosts when their conditions change. Okay, so, and there's lots of evidence for oscillations in host range. For the sake of time, I won't get into it. We've done some modeling, really nice modeling work that's been done with this, showing how these patterns can actually be reproduced in simulation models. I'll skip over that quickly. So the key to avoiding extinction is, again, this ability for inheritance systems to fluctuate in fitness space, and this combined geographical functional fitness space, depending on the conditions. External perturbations like climate change, they alter the geographical and functional dimensions of fitness space for multiple species. And if ecosystems were fragile, these perturbations would simply break them apart. But because of the evolutionary commons, ecosystems are resilient and they're changeable in proportion to their diversity and the capacities of the individual species for ecological fitting. So the biosphere, the entangled bank ecosystems, are constructed from repeated and overlapping cycles of taxon pulses and correlated oscillations in functional fitness space across multiple temporal and spatial scales. And the point is that this built-in capacity of individual inheritance systems to alternate between specialization and generalization, and by extension, the collective biosphere, this is how they avoid extinction. This is how they cope with change by constantly changing. Okay. So the biosphere is robust, it's resilient, it's responsive. But of course, there's limits to its evolvability. The information system produces prodigious amounts of capacity and affords them prodigious amounts of potential, and affords organisms prodigious amounts of potential to cope with change. But of course, they can't predict the future and are vulnerable to extinction. And so no matter how fit a species is in today's conditions, it can still be unfit tomorrow when conditions change. And so it is the case that individual inheritance systems, individual species, the trophic connections between species, they routinely go extinct. But at a larger scale, ecosystems, the biosphere as a whole, it persists, or at least it's persisted so far, because it has the capacity to absorb even massive amounts of perturbations. And this capacity arises from what is really a dual nature of organisms, right? They are both dual exploiters and explorers of their surroundings. And so this dual exploiter-explorer nature of organisms and by extension the ecosystems they form, this is the potential stored in the evolutionary commons to keep coping with change. Okay. So bringing this back to EID. So what are the lessons for emerging infectious disease? So the overarching message here, and the overarching message in the books that have been written and the recent volume that's come out, is that we can't disentangle the EID problem from the overall response of the biosphere to climate change. It's part of the overall response. It's fundamentally an expression of the same evolutionary potential that allows the rest of the biosphere to cope with change by changing. And the understanding of this problem is rooted in Darwinism and synthesized by the Stockholm Paradigm. So what does all this tell us, right? What does all this tell us? So the first thing is that the Stockholm Paradigm, or just evolutionary biology, tells us that in a period of global change, we should expect more host switching and therefore more EID. It tells us that the risk space for EID is very large. And it tells us that the realization of these risks increases the more ecosystems are perturbed, right? The more they change. So we know that the risk space for EID is substantial, but we also understand that the risk space is not random, right? Conservative inheritance means that the traits involved in transmitting parasites to hosts, like the ACE2 binding site, are highly specific. So the potential for EID is large, but where and when emerging infectious disease might emerge is predictable somewhat, at least based on knowledge of the traits of parasites and hosts. And this suggests proactive measures rooted in evolutionary principles. And in fact, this is what the DAMA protocol is all about. And DAMA is a direct application of the Stockholm Paradigm to the problem of emerging disease. And it fundamentally, it recognizes the risk space is large, but non-random, again, because of conservative inheritance. So it's designed to anticipate emerging infectious disease before it happens, or when it does, be better prepared to mitigate the spread of it, not just among humans, but among non-humans, using this foundation, using this evolutionary foundation, or the framework of the Stockholm Paradigm. So the last thing I'll say about it is that if we combine the Stockholm Paradigm, or this synthetic eco-evolutionary framework that we're talking about here, with DAMA, then we have what looks to be like a really powerful approach to transform the response to EID to a more proactive, evolutionarily informed effort. And I think that's the goal of the group, and certainly the goal of a lot of people within parasitology. Okay, thanks.
That's a great talk. Thanks.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any questions, John?
Well, yeah, that whole presentation was educational enough, or presented in a way that I think is broadly accessible for people beyond this seminar. So, stick it up on YouTube so it can be.
I appreciate that.
So, pardon me?
I appreciate that, because when I'm talking, I don't think it sounds good.
Well, no, it's I thought it was very accessible, and so in that sense, YouTube will allow it to get spread very quickly, very rapidly, and very broadly. Yeah. So
yeah. We recorded it, so it will go up a couple different places.
Oh, so, excellent.
Yeah,
excellent.
If you want us to, I mean, I decided not to put.
I'm happy for that.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
I'm happy for that. Absolutely.
All right. All right. Any other questions from or comments? for anybody out there in internet land or anybody local?
I-
We have one local. Go ahead.
I've got a very general question here. I know that, you know, with, I know, you know, with, I don't remember if it was Dan or someone else who dubbed their group, you know, your group, the Cassandra Collective, with the, resistance and the, kind of inertia that, you experience when trying to communicate with people in public health and medicine and things like that sometimes. I'm curious, has it in your experience, have you had any more luck dealing with people in kind of the defense, national defense, national security area?
Well, that's a really interesting idea. You know, I personally have almost no experience dealing with that side of it. So I think that would be a question for Dan or Eric or Walter if they've had any experience with that. But I haven't. But that's interesting as a group of people who might be interested.
Yeah, I think putting it up, and putting those questions out and discussing them is a great idea. So go ahead, Dan.
I would just say that the organization that spends the most money every year in the United States obtaining information about climate change from the National Research Council is the U.S. Department of Defense.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is, because they understand that unless we have a robust response to the things that are changing, we're toast.
Yeah.
So that's a good point, Dan. Dan, your hand's still up. Do you have something else to say?
Can I
Nope.
say something?
Oh,
Yeah,
go
the
ahead,
other
Eric.
issue is although the Defense Department is spending all of this money, all the information is siloed, and you have parallel things going on across different agencies with still a very minimal level of communication that leads to any kind of cohesive understanding or cohesive trajectory, I think, over time.
So what you're saying is that the research results, instead of being put out for understanding, are being only put into areas that can be used by specific governmental agencies.
Hmm.
Is that right? Is that right, Eric?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And at least with my experience in USDA over some number of years, that was always the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's something that, you know, lots of times we don't think about those things because a lot of us don't have the experience like you've had in the government, in the research enterprise. So yeah, it's a really important point.
Yeah.
All right. Any other comments from anyone out there? I see lots of people still with us.
I just want to say thanks a lot, Sal. That was really, really nice.
Oh, well, I appreciate that because I was afraid I was boring you.
I know.
You've heard this all before.
No, it was great. So let's see. Anything else? No? Okay, I think we'll basically we kind of went over time already, but it was great. So if anybody has questions, please send questions to us. I'm easy to find. And I'll forward them to Sal. He's easy to find too, so no problem. Go ahead.
Let me just say one more thing before I get off here, because I forgot to mention it in the talk. The cover of the Evolutionary Pathways volume, Walter, I think this is correct. You made that, right? That's your artwork?
Yeah, that's Walter's. He did it.
I love
He
that.
lost the original, and this was his second try, in fact.
Yeah, that's
I don't know if it's art.
Yeah, that's his. He
Yeah,
lost
well,
the one that
great.
we asked him to do, and then he had to find this one and redo it. I think, what'd you do in about a day?
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, so
Good stuff.
it's a good one because it reminds everybody where we are and what's happening at this time, just by looking at the front of the book. Really interesting. Okay, well, geez, thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us, Sal. It was great having you here in the lab. It
All
seems
right.
like you're just right here because you're on a really big screen in the lab. And so not only just a small one, so actually you can see yourself there.
Oh, wow.
There you are. So as soon as we get our t-shirts remade, we'll send it, everybody who's presented this year will get a t-shirt. And
Oh.
so we'll get one sent out to you as soon as we get them done. So
Great.
thanks a lot, everybody, for being here. And Vitaly has his t-shirt. You have yours on today? We sent one all the
Yes,
way to
exactly.
Ukraine last year,
Yeah.
so, all right.
People
Take it
ask
easy.
for me, Scott.
Yes, we'll get you one. All right, everybody, take it easy. Thanks so much, and we'll see everybody. Next week, we don't have seminar because it's Thanksgiving where we slaughter hosts and look at we look at these birds with nucleated red blood cells. So we'll see everybody the next week afterwards, after Thanksgiving. See everybody later. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye. Take care, Vitaly.
Yeah. See you later.
Hi,
Thanks for being
Hi,
there.
Eric. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to see
As
you.
well.
Excellent to see your smiling face there. And that you still are smiling is really remarkable. So keep in touch. Anything you guys need from us, let us know. Lajos, hello over there in on the other side of
Hello,
the
thank you
pond.
very much.
Yeah, thanks for being there. And please
My
join us
pleasure.
anytime. So
And Scott,
you.
yeah, go
just-
ahead, Eric.
just to confirm, you got all of the stuff I sent you yesterday?
I did. In fact, what I was doing today
Okay.
was just going through it bit by bit to make sure I have it all.
Okay,
So-
let me know if you need anything, and thanks.
Yeah, I've got it. It's I've put everything into its own little spot now. I'm making sure I have it all before I transmit it to Linnea.
Okay, thank
All
you.
right.
Yep.
Okay. In Lajos, we have our articles are all the book is coming out. The book has been sent to the printer. And so now we're simply waiting for the thing to be finished. I'm going to use the book for my parasitology class in January. So it will be out by then. So, so it's an amazing group. Okay, everybody, take it easy. Thanks, Eric. And hello to Mom. I see Mom is on. Take it easy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.